Ever been underestimated? Ever had someone look at you and assume you weren't capable? That's exactly what happened to 16-year-old Maya Jefferson as she stood alone in a courtroom, facing a judge who saw her as nothing more than a joke. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, officers, journalists, everyone gathered in anticipation, ready for what they expected to be an open and shut case. Maya, a black teenager, stood at the defendant's table wearing her school uniform, a faded blazer and a skirt that reached her knees. She looked small, almost invisible in the sea of adults, her eyes focused and determined. To everyone else, she appeared out of place. But Maya had grown used to that feeling. She had spent most of her life feeling like she didn't belong. At home, in the streets, at school, Maya often felt like she was walking a line that no one else could see. Her neighborhood, a place where danger often lurked just around the corner, had shaped her into someone who knew how to survive, how to keep her head down, how to never draw attention to herself. But none of that had prepared her for what had brought her here, into the heart of this courtroom, surrounded by a system that had already made up its mind about her. Across from her, the prosecution smirked, his confidence almost palpable. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly amused, and whispers filled the air, some wondering how this case would unfold, others assuming it was already decided. The judge chuckled lightly, his voice thick with condescension. "You mean to tell me you're representing yourself?" He shook his head, as if the idea of a young black girl standing alone in front of him was laughable. "How quaint," he muttered under his breath, his gaze flicking to the prosecutor. Maya's breath hitched in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had trained for this moment. She had practiced her speech in front of mirrors, reading the law books late into the night. The world might have underestimated her because of her age, her race, and her background, but that didn't matter to her. She knew she was capable. Maya had always known she was different in the best way. While others were busy underestimating her, Maya had been quietly accumulating a wealth of knowledge. Her genius didn't come from the textbooks that others thought were essential for success. It came from the way her mind worked, from the way she saw connections others couldn't, from the way she could take a complex situation and break it down to its simplest components. She had spent years honing this skill, whether it was in class or on the streets, observing, learning, adapting. It was her gift, and it was something no one could take away from her. When the case had first been handed to her, Maya had been terrified. The accusation was serious, and the consequences were heavy. But then, something clicked. She realized that while everyone assumed she was just a scared teenager, she had something they didn't: the ability to think, to strategize, and to find patterns in the chaos. And for the first time, Maya realized she wasn't just surviving. She was playing the game better than anyone else. Her story wasn't one of privilege. It wasn't one of easy opportunities or smooth roads. She had grown up in a world that often saw her as just another statistic, just another girl from a rough neighborhood, just another person the system had written off. But she wasn't just anything. She was Maya. And Maya was more than capable of handling whatever the world threw at her. The judge's chuckle had barely registered in her mind. She could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building. But Maya didn't flinch. She had learned how to handle pressure long ago. This moment, this fight, wasn't about being underestimated. It was about showing everyone that she wasn't who they thought she was, that she was more than the labels they slapped on her. Maya took a deep breath, standing tall as she faced the judge. They had no idea what was coming. As the whispers continued, Maya closed her eyes for a moment, centered herself, and began. Her voice was steady, clear, calm, but powerful. She was no longer the small girl in a too-big uniform. She was a force, and she was about to prove it. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age, race, or background? Tell us your story in the comments. Maya wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a troublemaker. She was an honor roll student, a young girl with big dreams of becoming an attorney. For years, she'd studied law in her free time, fascinated by how the legal system worked and how it could be used to bring about justice. Maya spent hours poring over textbooks, watching courtroom dramas, and listening to her mother, a dedicated social worker, explain the complexities of legal battles. Maya had never been involved in anything illegal. She had never even been in trouble at school. Her life was centered on the future she envisioned for herself, one where she used her sharp mind to fight for justice. But all of that changed 1 month ago, when Maya was wrongfully arrested at a convenience store. She had been there just like any other customer, shopping for a few snacks on her way home from school. She had walked through the aisles, browsed for a moment, and made her way to the counter to pay. However, a store clerk, eyeing her with suspicion, falsely accused Maya of stealing. The clerk didn't see her as a bright young girl with dreams of law school. Instead, all he saw was her skin color, and that was enough for him to label her a suspect. The situation quickly escalated. Maya tried to explain, to defend herself, but her voice fell on deaf ears. The police were called, and despite having done nothing wrong, Maya was arrested. The store's security footage, her only chance to prove her innocence, mysteriously disappeared, leaving her without any evidence to clear her name. And so, despite the lack of proof, Maya was charged with theft. Her public defender, a man who seemed barely awake during their meetings, barely paid attention to her case. Every time Maya tried to speak or explain what had happened, he cut her off or nodded off in his chair. It was clear he didn't care. The system had failed her before it even began. The prosecutor didn't seem interested in finding the truth. He was more concerned with getting another win under his belt. Maya tried to fight back, tried to get the attention of someone who would listen, but she quickly realized that no one cared. No one saw her as a person, as a future professional, as a daughter, or as an individual. She was just another black teenager, and that was enough to label her guilty in their eyes. No one was willing to stand up for her, and the people who were supposed to protect her were instead working against her. So Maya made a decision that no one expected. She fired her public defender and decided to represent herself. It wasn't a choice she made lightly. She knew the challenges she would face, but she also knew that she could not stand by and let the system crush her. She had learned how to fight from her mother, who had spent years battling for the rights of others, and she had spent countless hours studying the law. Maya was prepared in ways no one could see. The courtroom erupted in disbelief when Maya made her announcement. The judge laughed at her decision, dismissing it as a foolish mistake. The prosecution couldn't hide their smirks, sure that they would walk away with an easy victory. They saw Maya as just a child, someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of the law. The media, always eager for a spectacle, picked up the story. The headlines were full of mockery and doubt. "She's a kid," one journalist said. "This is ridiculous," another commented. "She won't last 5 minutes," they all laughed. What they didn't know was that Maya had spent years preparing for this moment. She had grown up watching her mother fight legal battles, witnessing firsthand how the law could be used for good or twisted for injustice. Maya wasn't just playing at law, she had studied it in depth. She had always been fascinated by the power of the legal system and how it could be used to right wrongs. She wasn't intimidated by the courtroom or the challenges ahead. She knew what she was doing. She just hadn't realized how much it would matter until now. Maya had been underestimated her entire life. But this time, she would show everyone that she was capable of far more than they thought. She had prepared for this moment her whole life. Now, it was time to show them what she was made of. Day 1 of the trial had arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The prosecutor, his confidence oozing from every word, smirked as he laid out what he claimed was an airtight case against Maya. He presented what he called the evidence that Maya was guilty of theft, backed by a store clerk's testimony that had been carefully crafted to fit his narrative. Maya stood at the defendant's table, her posture straight, her face calm, but inside she was a storm of focus and determination. The judge, an older man with a graying beard, hardly spared her a glance, already assuming that the outcome was inevitable. To him, she was just another teenage girl caught in a moment of weakness, a girl who had no business in this courtroom. The whispers from the gallery seemed to echo his assumptions. "Your Honor, I will prove today that Miss Jefferson was caught red-handed," the prosecutor said with an air of finality. His words were like a sentence to many in the room, but not to Maya. She had prepared for this. She wasn't here to simply stand trial. She was here to dismantle the lie piece by piece. It was her turn to speak now. Maya stood up, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. She stepped forward confidently, her heart pounding but her voice steady. The first step was to cross-examine the store clerk, the man who had falsely accused her. "You said I was standing near the register when you saw me take the item?" Maya asked, her tone calm and direct, not a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Yes," the clerk answered quickly, his expression smug. Maya's eyes locked onto him, and she didn't look away. "And where were you standing at the time?" she asked, her words carefully measured. "By the coffee machine," the clerk said without hesitation. "So, roughly 20 feet away." Maya's voice was crisp now, sharper as she pressed him further. The clerk hesitated for a moment. "Yes," he muttered, realizing where this was going. Maya nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She turned to face the judge, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Your Honor," she began, her voice now clear and full of authority. "The security camera closest to the register would have proven my innocence. But, mysteriously, it was deleted." A ripple of gasps echoed through the courtroom as the weight of her words landed. The judge's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he leaned forward slightly, a flicker of intrigue in his gaze. The courtroom had been silent up until now, but Maya had begun to shift the balance. Maya wasn't just presenting evidence. She was revealing the cracks in the prosecution's case, pulling apart the narrative they had built piece by piece. The prosecutor sputtered, clearly taken aback. "Objection! Speculation!" he barked, but the judge merely raised a hand, signaling for him to quiet down. The air was thick with the realization that Maya wasn't just playing along. She was challenging everything they had presented so far. "Your Honor," Maya continued, now in full command of the room, "if the security footage had been preserved, I could have proved my innocence. But instead, we're left with only the words of someone who wasn't even close enough to see what happened. The evidence is gone, and I stand here, unfairly accused. Maya unfolded the paper with careful precision, her eyes scanning the words one last time, before she turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "I request that this be submitted into evidence." The judge barely glanced at her, still dismissive, his attitude still reflecting the assumptions he had made about her. He reached for the letter with an almost bored expression, expecting it to be just another tactic from a teenager with no legal understanding. But as he began reading, something changed. The room fell silent as his face turned pale, his eyes flicking back and forth from the paper to Maya, and then to the prosecutor. The judge's posture shifted, and his fingers trembled slightly as he finished reading. His gaze moved swiftly to the store clerk, who had been quiet until that moment. The clerk's face, which had previously been smug, was now red with panic. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. What was in the letter? Maya waited, her gaze unwavering as the room remained tense. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but it was clear he was rattled. His voice was no longer steady when he spoke. What is this?" he asked, his words faltering as he looked from the letter to Maya, as if trying to make sense of what he had just read. Maya, however, didn't flinch. "It's a signed confession, Your Honor," she said with quiet confidence. A whistleblower from the convenience store has come forward, revealing that the store's owner regularly falsified reports of theft to collect insurance money. The charges against me were never about truth. They were about a scheme to make money off of false accusations. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, suddenly looked like he had lost his footing. He fumbled for words, stammering in disbelief. His previously confident posture crumbled as the truth began to sink in. The courtroom exploded into chaos as the news settled in. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. The defense and prosecution seemed to be in shock, the reality of what was happening too much to process at once. The prosecutor's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The judge, who had laughed at Maya just moments ago, now looked nervous. His hands shook slightly as he glanced at the store clerk, whose panic was growing. It was as if the weight of the situation had finally hit him. "Where did you get this?" the judge finally asked, his voice shaking, a far cry from his earlier dismissive tone. Maya met his gaze, not a hint of hesitation in her voice. "From someone who still believes in justice," she said confidently, her words cutting through the chaos. "A person who knew the truth and wasn't afraid to make it known." The prosecutor's face was a picture of disbelief, his earlier arrogance now replaced by confusion. The courtroom had gone from a place of certainty and conviction to one of uncertainty, where the scales of justice were tipping in a direction they had never anticipated. Maya had delivered the truth in a way no one could ignore. The store clerk, now visibly sweating and trembling, refused to meet anyone's eyes. His role in the scam was laid bare, and it was clear that the evidence Maya had uncovered would not let him escape the consequences. Maya stood tall, her heart pounding, with the realization that she had just turned the case in her favor. This wasn't just about defending herself. This was about exposing a system that had been corrupt, about showing that the law could still be used for truth and fairness. Maya hadn't just taken a stand for herself. She had taken a stand for anyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked by a system that cared more about winning than the room was still, and for the first time, the judge seemed to be listening to her, really listening. The prosecutor had no quick rebuttal. His confidence had begun to falter. The whispers from the gallery grew louder, filled with surprise. Maya wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was unraveling the very foundation of the case against her. The judge's expression was unreadable, but his eyes never left Maya. He hadn't expected this. He had thought this trial would be easy, a simple case with a clear outcome. Instead, Maya had turned the tables. She wasn't just a teenager who had been underestimated by everyone around her. She was a force in that courtroom, and she had just shown them that she was far more than they could have imagined. As she returned to her seat, Maya's heart still raced, but she allowed herself a moment of triumph. She wasn't just fighting for her life in that courtroom. She was showing the world that no one, no matter their age, race, or background, should ever be underestimated. This wasn't just her fight. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Then came the bombshell Maya had been waiting for. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the sealed envelope she had hidden there. The time had come. Maya stood up, her hands steady. Despite the storm raging inside her, she pulled out the letter, holding it up for everyone to see. The prosecutor, still smug and confident, didn't notice the shift in the air, but Maya could feel it. This was the moment that would change everything. About justice. And for the first time in the trial, Maya felt a powerful, undeniable sense of triumph. The fight was far from over, but she had already changed the course of the case, and that, in itself, was a victory. With no choice but to face the truth, the judge sat back in his chair, his face drained of color. The weight of the moment seemed to press on him, the air thick with the tension of what was about to come. He had been caught off guard, completely unprepared for the turn the trial had taken. Maya had done the unthinkable. She had uncovered the truth, exposed the lie that had been constructed against her, and shattered the facade of the courtroom's supposed certainty. After a long pause, the judge's voice finally broke the silence. "Case dismissed," he said, his words heavy, almost reluctant. Criminal charges dropped. The courtroom, still reeling from the bombshell revelation of the whistleblower's confession, erupted into a stunned silence. The judge looked down at his notes, his fingers tapping against the desk nervously as he processed the consequences of his ruling. "The store owner is under investigation for fraudulent activity," he added, his voice lacking the confidence it had once carried. Maya had done the impossible. She had not only cleared her name, but also exposed a network of deceit that no one, not even the prosecutor, had seen coming. A 16-year-old had outsmarted an entire courtroom full of professionals, people who had believed they were in control, people who had thought they knew the outcome from the start. But Maya had rewritten the script. She had proven them all wrong. The judge, who had once been so smug, now looked defeated. His eyes flicked over to the prosecutor, who was silent, his mouth slightly agape, no longer sure of what to say. His usual bluster had vanished, replaced by the quiet realization that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as too young, too inexperienced. The media, who had sensationalized Maya's decision to represent herself, were scrambling to rewrite their headlines, scrambling to make sense of what had just unfolded in front of them. The story they had anticipated, an easy conviction of a misguided teenager, had been completely flipped on its head. The courtroom was no longer the arena where they expected a quick win. It was a battleground where Maya had claimed victory, where the system had failed her and she had succeeded. "I underestimated you," the judge finally admitted, his words heavy with a mix of begrudging respect and discomfort. He had seen many cases in his career, but never one quite like this. Maya had made him realize how deeply he had misjudged her. She wasn't the young, naive girl he had assumed. She was a force, a mind that had been carefully sharpened and capable of dismantling everything he thought he knew about justice. But Maya didn't need his validation. She had never needed the judge's approval, nor did she care about the prosecutor's respect. The real victory for her wasn't the dismissal of the charges or the spotlight that now shone on her, though those things meant something too. It was about proving to herself and to the world that she was more than the labels placed on her. She had stood up for herself, for what was right, and had fought a battle that no one expected her to win. She had fought and won on her own terms. Without a word, Maya turned away from the courtroom, the buzz of conversation rising behind her. She walked out of the room with her head held high, the sound of her footsteps steady and sure. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The courtroom, once filled with people who had doubted her, was now nothing more than a memory. Maya had moved beyond their expectations, beyond their assumptions. She had become something they couldn't dismiss. And as she stepped out into the world outside, she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer just a girl on trial. She was a young woman who had taken control of her own destiny, and no one would ever be able to underestimate her again. A week later, Maya's name was trending nationwide. The video of her courtroom battle, once dismissed by the public as a sideshow, had gone viral. Millions had watched her stand tall in the face of overwhelming odds, taking on a legal system that had tried to bury her and revealing the truth hidden behind the lies. The world had witnessed a young woman outsmarting seasoned professionals, and they couldn't look away. Civil rights lawyers reached out, offering to mentor her and encouraging her to pursue a career in law. Universities extended scholarship offers, eager to have someone like Maya join their ranks. Even one of the judges who had been present at the trial wrote to her personally, praising her determination and intellect, urging her to continue on her path to become a lawyer. Maya, once just another young girl from the wrong side of the tracks, was now being seen as someone capable of changing the world. But Maya didn't get caught up in the accolades. She had never fought for recognition. She had fought because the truth mattered. She was already planning her future. The victory she had achieved wasn't just about the case. It was about something far bigger. It was the beginning of a journey, the start of a life where she would continue to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or silenced. In an interview with a major news outlet, Maya was asked what the win meant to her. She paused for a moment, reflecting on how far she had come. "I wasn't supposed to win," she said, her voice steady and sure. "But they underestimated the wrong person." The words resonated with millions of people who had once been told that they weren't good enough, that they couldn't achieve their dreams. Maya's story was a reminder that no matter how small you might seem, no matter the odds stacked against you, it only takes one person to change everything. The smallest voice in the room, like Maya's, could shake the foundations of even the most powerful systems. As Maya moved forward with her plans for the future, she understood that her battle had only just begun. The courtroom had been just one of many steps. She had a future ahead of her, one that was shaped by the lessons she had learned, that no one could define her, that her worth wasn't determined by what others thought of her, and that her voice, no matter how young or small, could make a difference. Never let anyone tell you what you're capable of, Maya said, her words carrying the weight of her journey. Sometimes, the smallest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. Her story had proven that. It was a story of defying expectations, of standing tall against a world that tried to push her down. And as she prepared for the next chapter of her life, she was determined to make sure that no one ever underestimated her again. What do you think about Maya's story? Have you ever been underestimated? Drop your thoughts below.